Hey, most excellent rock buds, it's Rock Papa. Hope you guys are doing well today and staying cool. I have a new rock for you today, so let's have a look. Okay, so here she is. It is. First thing I notice about this rock is that it is pinkish reddish. Let's take a closer look. Look how thin. I think most of you already know what this is. Let's see if we can scratch it. Yep. We can scratch it with our thumbnail, so it's soft. So, is it igneous? No, it's not igneous because igneous rocks are volcanic rocks. Like basalt, like granite, diorite, and andesite. Is it sedimentary? Yep, it's sedimentary. That's just kind of intuitive because it's so thin. And that thinness and the softness is saying what kind of sedimentary rock. Right, shale. This is a shale. It's very interesting because most shales are not reddish like that. For example, here's some shale. If you look closely, you can see fern imprints in this shell. And this shell is dark, kind of grayish or even blackish. Most shells that you find are grayish, dark grayish. So what's the difference? We have a red shell and a gray shell. Well, that is a good question, so let's look into that. This shell is Pennsylvanian period shell. And just looking at it, we can answer the question, were there plants growing on the surface of the earth back during the Pennsylvanian time? And the answer is yes, obviously, because we have imprints. We have a fern imprint here and other kind of imprints as well. So there's a stem imprint of some kind of plant. So we know that plants were on the earth during Pennsylvanian time. On the other hand, this shale was deposited during Cambrian time. About 550 million years ago to about 500 million years ago. So our big question is, were plants growing on the land back during the Cambrian time? And the obvious answer is no, because the Cambrian period was the very first explosion of life, and that happened in the oceans. So what do you think is the difference? Why pink shell versus grayish-black shell? You got it already, organic matter. Back during Cambrian time, nothing was growing on the land. Erosion occurred mightily. Rains and storms hit and washed all kinds of materials off of the land, including iron. And that iron got dissolved and mixed in with the silt and mud that became shale, and that's why we have this reddish color. It also tells us that this shale spent some time in the open air because the iron in it is oxidized to red color instead of reduced. Reduced would be if it was deposited right into the ocean immediately, like if you have a rift basin situation. In that case, the iron would be reduced and it would be a kind of a greenish or dark color. So that tells us a lot about this shale. let's take a look at the context, the Cambrian context in which this shale was deposited. And by the way, this is Conasauga Shale. Conasauga Formation Shale of the Cambrian Period. It may also be Rome Shale, very similar. So let's figure out how this happened. So the big question is, what was happening during the Cambrian Period between 550 million years ago and about 500 million years ago? Well, as we know, Rodinia supercontinent had recently rifted apart into separate continents, one of which was our continent. You can call it whatever you like, Laurentia, I don't know, ancient North America. After supercontinents rift apart, the continent pieces that result usually slowly sink down, or either the ocean rises. So let's picture this situation where we have the ancient North American continent, and it has been separated from the supercontinent of Rodinia, and the sea is rising. Okay, so let's picture the edge of a continent with rivers flowing out from the mountains in the Piedmont through the coastal plain and into the sea. Well, those rivers can carry a lot of sand, silt, and mud. But as they get wider and deeper and closer to the ocean, their velocity slows down, and so the sand drops out, and that's where we get our sandy coastal plains and our sand beaches. The silt and mud can be carried by these rivers out even further because they're smaller particles, and so, but as the velocity of the water slows down even further, the silt and the mud is dropped out, and let's just say maybe 100 feet deep or so is the area where this mud is dropped out and forms a kind of a layer of mud. Now let's go even further out till we get about 300 feet deep, plus or minus, and out there you have a lot of sea creatures that are living that incorporate calcium carbonate in their shells, and there's maybe some very fine mud. So those sea creatures, when they die, their shells go down to the bottom and create a kind of a lime-rich mud. So you've got, at the land edge, you've got lots of sand. At the depth of 100 feet, plus or minus, you have mud. And about 300 feet deep, plus or minus, you have limey mud that's going to become limestone. Well, now let's picture a situation like I've talked about, where the oceans are rising. When the ocean rises, this is called a transgression. The ocean is transgressing onto the edge of the continent. So now the place where the sand beaches were is covered with water, maybe to 100 feet deep. And so what's deposited on top of all these old beach sands? Yeah, mud. And as the water continues to get deeper, let's say it's 300 feet deep, what's deposited on top of the mud? Yeah, limey mud. It's going to become limestone. So as the sea transgresses and gets deeper, you get a layer of sand on the bottom, which represents the sand beaches. On top of that, you get a layer of mud, which represents the mud flats and the intercoastal waterways that are about 100 feet deep, plus or minus. And then on top of that, you get a layer of limey mud that turns into limestone. So the sand eventually becomes sandstone and may be metamorphosed into quartzite. The mud, silt and mud, becomes shale that eventually may be metamorphosed into slate. And the limey mud becomes limestone. Here's a most excellent book that I have kept all these years from my undergrad geology days. So let's open her up and see what she has to offer us today. These are rocks that we find that were deposited during this Cambrian rift-to-drift sequence. So, in the eastern United States, you had the Chilhowie sandstone, which is not listed by Dunbar, etc. But you'll see that the Rome shale formation is listed. And here's the Conasauga shale. That's what we're looking at today. Okay, so you had quartzite, which represents the sand beaches, Chickee's quartzite, Antietam quartzite. This is sandstone from the sand beaches that has been metamorphosed into quartzite. And then came shales, the Rome shale and our Conasauga shale. On top of that, you had dolomite, which is calcium magnesium carbonate, very similar to limestone. And this limestone, I can't pronounce it. So that's the Cambrian rift-to-drift succession in the eastern, southern, and central Appalachians. Let's go over to the western U.S. Okay, we're in the Canadian Rockies, the House Range of Utah, and Wyoming and Montana. So we have the Fort Mountain sandstone and the Prospect Mountain sandstone that represents those sand beaches of the early Cambrian. We have St. Piran sandstone. And then we have the Pioche shale, which happened about the same time as our Conasauga/Rome shale. Same formation. And then we get into the Cathedral dolomite, the Dome limestone, the Wheeler limestone, which is part of Mount Wheeler out in Great Basin, Wheeler Peak out in Great Basin National Park that Grammy and I have summited long ago. So you see that this rift-to-drift sandstone covered by shale, covered by limestone sequence happened all over the United States. In the middle of the country, it was less apparent because the middle of the country is not the edges of the country. We have the Conasauga/Rome shale. Happened during the Cambrian rift-to-drift time, Cambrian period, 550 to about 500 million years ago. The rift-to-drift sequence was happening because the edge of the ancient North American continent was sinking. The sea transgressed. The beaches were covered by shale. The shale was covered by dolomite and limestone. And that stimulated the explosion, Cambrian explosion of life, which consisted of sea creatures of all kinds. Why is this not dark like other shales? Because there were no plants to provide organic matter on the land. However, there was a lot of iron out there, and so the iron in this rock, iron was incorporated into this rock and oxidized as it made its progress into the sea. Okay, most excellent rock buds, thank you so much for watching. If this video was useful and helpful, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps me. And this is your Rock Papa saying, happy rock hunting. Papa out.